So we're going to be continuing with the church history, and we left off talking about Charlemagne, about his reign as he was crowned as the king or the emperor of the West, and this led further on. When we go further on, it will lead to the schism, one of the reasons why the schism happened. And then we talked about the Renaissance that happened at that time, as the writings changed. There's Reformation in terms of education, and Charlemagne was trying to be the next Constantine, bringing back the classical Roman era back into the Frankish Empire. And so we will continue talking about what happened after Charlemagne's reign. So what happened after Charlemagne's reign is when he died, his son Louis takes the rulership, and the land gets divided among Louis's sons. So when Louis dies, he divides it among his sons, and the sons have rivalry. They fight amongst each other, and they are rebellious even during the life of Louis. And after the death, they divided the empire amongst themselves and pretty much caused civil war with themselves, and the nations start to be formed, what we tend to know as France, as Germany, and then the middle portion was one of his sons, and that's where the mix of different emperors or different states were formed, or countries were formed, like Switzerland, for example, Belgium, and Netherlands, and those type of things. And so also during this time is when the German portion of the region, so one of the sons of Louis, his portion, they were given the title of the Holy Roman Empire, and it was under Otto the Great, and he was crowned by the Pope as the first Holy Roman Emperor. So if you remember, Charlemagne was crowned as a Roman Emperor in the West, and Otto the Great was crowned as the first Holy Roman Emperor. And the title was amongst the German leaders. They were the ones that carried this title, the ones that were called the Holy Roman Emperor during the time through the Middle Ages. And so, and because of this, the French were in opposition because the Germans were gaining power, and then the French were in opposition, and there happened fightings between them also, and a bunch of political things that we'll go into later. But to continue, we're going to be talking about the High Middle Ages. So this is the period between 1000 AD to 1300s, and so this is an era where it's called by some scholars the Golden Years, because this is where there was much less wars, much less raids. The knighthood was on the rise, defending the regions from raids from Vikings and other issues that might have arose. And this period is when it was the best years, if you can call it that, of the Middle Ages. And these times, the population was not literate, so not everyone could read and write like most of us do over here. But just because they're illiterate does not make them stupid. So just because they can't write doesn't make us smarter than them. But in reality, if you compare them to us, they had much greater memories than we do. So they were a lot better at remembering things, and as we see a trend today, technology is on the rise and our memory is on a decline. So for us, we don't spend much time focusing on memorization because we can always find it in electronics. We can always look it up. So our memory is a lot weaker than them, and they could like recite passages from scripture. They can recite different poems, different history points, and so they were illiterate, but their memories were a lot stronger. And in that time, the lay folks, they relied on memory for the things of faith. So they relied on memorizing different things maybe the priest said or their bishop said, and then remembering stories that were passed on from generation to generation. And it was also commonplace for them, if they needed to know something concerning faith, they would turn to the church. If they wanted to know what's right, what's wrong, they went to the church. When they wanted to go for guidance, they went to the church. They went to the pastor, to the priest. And the faith aspect, it was kind of ritualistic. They just did as they were expected. It was based on the sacraments. And in comparison between us and them, they did not have that big of a problem as we do nowadays as playing the Christian on Sundays. And the rest of the week you live however you want. But they were more they were more, I guess, disciplined in a sense. They were Christians throughout the day, more of Christians throughout the day than most professing Christians nowadays. And so their personal and their well-being was concerning faith was attended to by the clergy and the priests, and they were trying to be faithful to God. And so they had three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoner estates. And so the way they divided it is the clergy is like the priest or pastors as one who prays. The nobility was the ones who fight. And then the commoners were the ones that worked. And these were the peasants, these were the serfs, these were the people that worked the lands. So it kind of got divided into these classes, and clergy was the least, the nobility, and then the serfs. So it's in a pyramid fashion. And you were born into these estates. So once you were born a serf, you stay a serf. You're born into nobility, you stay nobility. Once you're born into clergy or you go into clergy, you remain a clergy. And it was believed that this was ordained by God this way. So it was predestined for you to be in whatever line you were born into. You were predestined to be there, and you had to stay in there. And if you tried to change your level, if you, for example, a peasant and tried to be a nobility, this was in a way looked upon as you're usurping your way that God has set for you. You are rebelling against God. And so that is the mentality that they had in those times. And the king was started to classify themselves outside these estates. They're trying to say that they're God's representative here on earth. And same thing with the popes. They're also trying to separate from this estate too, saying that also they are God's representative in spiritual matters. So we see they're trying to get out of this structure and trying to be above the structure. And the nobility tries to control the church. And so the king tries to control the church, considers himself to be in God's stead, so he's able to, say to the church what he wants to do. The Pope doesn't like this, and they consider themselves in God's stead, so the papacy starts to say that they are the only ones that can control the church. And no one else is able to, no king can say to the church what they must do. They have to turn to the Pope, and the Pope will tell them what to do. And so the clergy started to be more involved in politics, started to rule over the people. And at this time, that's where there's a lot of clash between the king and the emperor. And then once we go past this, we see feudalism starts to rise too. This is where this starts because of the Viking raids. So Vikings came from Scandinavia. This is modern day Norway, Sweden, Denmark, those areas. That's where the Vikings came from. And they came down and they traveled by boats down the rivers, and they were masters of the water. They used the rivers because the ships can go through their ships were built in such a way, they mastered the way of shipbuilding in such a way that they were able to go through all types of waters. They could go in shallow waters, deep waters, whatever waters they needed to go. They had superior ships that could go through all these waters, and they targeted the weak targets. They passed by the heavily armed areas, so very fortified areas, they just passed by, but the weak areas, they attacked and looted them. And the reason why they fought is because they took loot, so they didn't just fight just because they thought it was fun, but they took loot, so they got what they wanted, I guess, whatever they saw and they liked, they took. But it was not to spread their empire. They're not trying to become big. They didn't want to be the next Roman Empire or even the Frankish Empire. They just wanted to get the loot. And another reason is they fought because of their religious background. The way they thought is they had the idea of Ragnarok, or like the end times, where everything will come and be destroyed, and they want to be in the honorable, as the religion states, in the honorable position to be those who pretty much are in an honorable position in the afterlife. And the way to achieve this was to fight in battle, and or to die in battle, or participate in a glorious battle. So that was another reason why they went and fought and did raids. And this, as the Vikings came down and went to Europe and started to loot, and as they did this, it divided the Carolingian Empire. And the knights, people saw that they needed defense, so they rose up knights, appointed knights to defend the areas. The knights were subject to the kings, but the knights were there to defend certain areas. And in return, they received land, they received serfs, so people that worked their lands. And so this is how this feudal system started to rise. And then also serfs were kind of like slaves that could not travel from land to land. They were stuck to their land they were appointed to. And if you think about it right now, if you say this type of society or structure, people will start protesting, rebelling, maybe even riots. But back then, it was actually looked favorably upon by the serfs because people valued or preferred to be serfs over freedmen because they had the security and the stability for what they received from the knights. So the knights assured that they have a steady job, they have food for their household, and security from other maybe barbarians or Vikings that came and attacked. They had security that the knights would protect them. So they preferred security over freedom in those times. And if you look at a structure for them, if you say there's a tyrant, they didn't look at a tyrant as the opposite is democracy or freedom and democracy. They looked as the opposite of a tyrant is to have a good king. So we see the whole structure was completely different from our structure. And from then, next week, we're going to go into more about knights and what they were and what they did.